The California sun blazed mercilessly over Camp Pendleton's flight line, its heat creating shimmering waves that danced across the concrete where millions of dollars worth of military aircraft sat in precise formation. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster wiped sweat from her forehead as she emerged from beneath the massive Apache helicopter, her uniform stained with grease and her expression reflecting 3 days of mounting frustration. At 29, Melissa had earned her reputation as one of the finest helicopter technicians in the Marine Corps, capable of diagnosing problems that left other mechanics scratching their heads. But the AH-64, the Apache longbow sitting before her, had become her professional nemesis, a puzzle that seemed to mock every diagnostic technique in her considerable arsenal. Still nothing on the primary engine diagnostics, she called out to Master Sergeant Robert Hill, who was reviewing technical manuals with the grim determination of a man whose career depended on solving an impossible problem. At 38, Hill had seen enough broken aircraft to recognize when something was seriously wrong, and today's situation had him genuinely worried. The Apache was scheduled for a critical demonstration flight in 48 hours, with Pentagon officials and international allies observing. Failure wasn't just embarrassing, it could affect millions in defense contracts. "The engine turns over fine," Hill muttered, running his weathered hands through graying hair. "All systems show green across the board, but the moment we try to engage full power, everything shuts down like we're hitting some kind of invisible wall. It's like the aircraft's protecting itself from something we can't identify." Captain Matthew Lewis, the Apache's primary pilot, stood nearby with the frustrated expression of someone whose professional competence was being questioned by an inanimate object. At 31, Matthew had logged over 1,500 hours in Apache helicopters, flying missions from Afghanistan to training exercises across the continental United States. He understood his aircraft's behavior better than most people understood their own cars, which made the current situation particularly maddening. "I've never experienced anything like this," Matthew said, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose patience was wearing thin. "The aircraft responds normally to all pre-flight checks. Every system appears functional until we reach critical power settings. Then it's like someone pulls the plug on everything at once." The maintenance area around the Apache had become a small command center, with diagnostic equipment, technical manuals, and frustrated personnel creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis, barely 25 and eager to prove himself, had been running diagnostic tests for hours with results that defied conventional explanation. "Sergeant Foster," Ethan called out, consulting his tablet with growing confusion. "I'm getting readings that don't match anything in the technical manuals. The engine management system shows normal operation, but there's some kind of feedback loop in the power distribution network that's causing safety shutdowns." Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans approached the group with the measured steps of someone who had spent 20 years troubleshooting aircraft that didn't want to cooperate. As the Apache maintenance chief, Evans had earned respect throughout camp. Pendleton for his ability to solve problems that stumped younger technicians. "I've contacted Dr. Rebecca Reynolds from the Pentagon's Aerospace Consulting Division," Evans announced, his voice carrying the weight of professional desperation. "She's supposed to be one of the leading experts on Apache engine management systems. If anyone can identify what we're dealing with, it should be her." The mention of outside contractors sent a ripple of mixed emotions through the maintenance crew. On one hand, expert consultation might provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. On the other hand, admitting that military personnel couldn't solve their own aircraft problems carried implications that could affect careers and unit reputation. Colonel Jeffrey Walsh emerged from the nearby hangar with the purposeful stride of someone whose day had been consumed by crisis management. At 48, Walsh had commanded Camp Pendleton's aviation units through budget cuts, deployment cycles, and the constant pressure of maintaining readiness in an increasingly complex world. "Chief Evans," Walsh called out, his voice carrying across the maintenance area with unmistakable authority. "I need a realistic assessment of our timeline. The demonstration flight is in less than 48 hours, and I've got Pentagon officials asking questions I can't answer." Evans straightened instinctively, his years of military service responding to command presence with automatic respect. "Sir, we're exploring all available options. Dr. Reynolds should arrive this afternoon with specialized diagnostic equipment. If anyone can identify the problem, it's her." But none of the Marines struggling with their maintenance crisis noticed the figure watching them from the perimeter fence that separated the base from the civilian world. Alexander "Tank" Woods stood in the shadows of the overpass that had become his temporary home, his weathered features and torn clothing marking him as one of the homeless veterans who survived on the margins of the military community they had once served. Tank's keen eyes, still sharp despite years of hardship, were focused on the Apache helicopter with an intensity that would have surprised anyone who bothered to look. But to the Marines struggling with their maintenance crisis, he was invisible. Just another casualty of a system that had forgotten its obligations to those who had served and sacrificed. The morning sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, its heat promising another day of frustration for the maintenance crew and mounting pressure for everyone whose career depended on solving the Apache's mysterious problems. What none of them realized was that the solution to their crisis was standing less than 100 yards away, hidden in plain sight among the forgotten veterans that society preferred to ignore. As Tank watched the expensive equipment arrive, and the consultants prepare their sophisticated diagnostic procedures, his weathered hands gripped the chain-link fence. He could see what they were missing, the subtle signs that spoke of a problem he had encountered before in the heat of combat zones where mechanical failure meant death for the pilots who depended on his expertise. The convergence of pride, desperation, and hidden expertise was about to create a confrontation that would challenge everything the Marines thought they knew about competence, respect, and the true cost of abandoning those who had served their country with distinction. Dr. Rebecca Reynolds arrived at Camp Pendleton with the fanfare typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Her gleaming black sedan, followed by a truck loaded with diagnostic equipment that cost more than most people's annual salaries, represented the Pentagon's faith in civilian expertise over military competence. At 52, Reynolds had built her reputation by solving problems that stumped military maintenance crews, and her fees reflected her status as someone who could make impossible situations disappear with the right combination of expertise and expensive technology. A tailored business suit and expensive briefcase marked her as someone who operated at the intersection of technical knowledge and political influence. "General Patricia Taylor," Reynolds called out as she approached the maintenance area, her voice carrying the smooth professionalism of someone whose livelihood depended on projecting confidence. "I received your urgent consultation request and flew out immediately. I understand we're dealing with Apache engine management anomalies that have proven resistant to conventional diagnostic approaches." General Taylor, known throughout the Marine Corps as the Iron Lady for her unwavering determination and absolute intolerance for failure, nodded approvingly. At 54, Taylor had earned her nickname through a combination of strategic brilliance and an iron will that had propelled her through the ranks of Marine leadership. Her presence at Camp Pendleton meant that failure was no longer just professionally embarrassing. It could be career-ending for everyone involved. "Dr. Reynolds," Taylor replied, "I'm counting on your expertise to identify what our maintenance personnel have missed. This aircraft must be operational within 48 hours, and failure is not an acceptable outcome." Reynolds surveyed the Apache helicopter with the practiced assessment of someone who had diagnosed complex aircraft problems across multiple military installations. Her eyes moved systematically across the aircraft's external components, taking in the diagnostic equipment that surrounded it and the frustrated expressions of the maintenance crew. I'll need to review all diagnostic data from the past 72 hours, Reynolds announced, setting down her briefcase with careful precision. My preliminary assessment suggests we're likely dealing with a cascade failure in the engine management system. Multiple components experiencing sympathetic failures that create diagnostic shadows masking the primary problem. The technical language was impressive, delivered with the kind of authority that typically convinced military personnel. They were dealing with someone whose expertise exceeded their own. Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans stepped forward with the accumulated diagnostic reports, his expression carrying the hope of someone who desperately needed expert validation. Meanwhile, Tank had moved closer to the perimeter fence. His weathered hands gripped the chain link as he observed the expensive consultant's arrival with growing interest. From his position outside the fence, he could see diagnostic patterns and equipment configurations that suggested the maintenance crew had already covered most of the areas Reynolds claimed to be exploring with her specialized approach. Tank's appearance continued to mark him as society's invisible casualty, torn clothing that had seen too many nights outdoors, weathered skin that reflected years of exposure to the elements, and the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had learned to survive on society's margins. But beneath the surface damage of homelessness and neglect, something else remained intact, the kind of technical intuition that couldn't be taught in schools or purchased through consulting contracts. But based on my preliminary analysis, Reynolds announced to the assembled group after reviewing the documentation, we're likely dealing with a sensor integration failure that's creating false positive readings in the engine management system. The aircraft safety protocols are responding to phantom data that suggests catastrophic failure conditions that don't actually exist. The explanation sounded authoritative and technically sophisticated, exactly the kind of diagnosis that justified expensive consulting fees and provided political cover for military leadership. General Taylor nodded approvingly, clearly relieved to have a professional assessment that suggested the problem was both identifiable and solvable. How long will it take to confirm your diagnosis and implement a solution? Taylor asked her, voice carrying the urgency of someone whose career depended on meeting impossible deadlines. I'll need approximately 6 hours to run comprehensive diagnostics using my specialized equipment, Reynolds replied confidently. Once we've isolated the faulty sensor integration pathways, the repair should be straightforward, probably involving replacement of specific control modules and recalibration of the engine management system. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster approached Reynolds with the respectful deference typically shown to expensive consultants, but her expression carried the skepticism of someone whose hands-on experience had taught her to question theoretical expertise that hadn't been tested against mechanical reality. Dr. Reynolds, Melissa said carefully, we've already tested the sensor integration pathways using standard protocols. The readings appeared normal across all monitored systems. What makes you think we're dealing with phantom data rather than actual system failures? Reynolds' expression tightened slightly, reflecting the kind of professional irritation that came from having her expertise questioned by personnel whose credentials didn't match her own. Sergeant Foster, she replied, with carefully controlled condescension. Standard military diagnostic protocols are designed for routine maintenance issues. The problems we're dealing with here require more sophisticated analysis techniques that go beyond conventional troubleshooting approaches. From his position at the fence, Tank had been listening to the conversation with growing frustration. That went beyond professional disagreement. The consultant's explanation sounded impressive to people who didn't understand the specific systems involved, but to someone who had actually worked on these aircraft under combat conditions, her diagnosis felt like expensive guesswork dressed up in technical language. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis observed the interaction with growing unease. His limited experience was nevertheless sufficient to recognize when expensive consultants were providing explanations that sounded impressive, but didn't necessarily address the specific symptoms they had been observing for 3 days. "Ma'am," Ethan said hesitantly, "the shutdown pattern we've been seeing doesn't seem random like you'd expect from faulty sensors. It's very consistent, always happens at the same power settings, always follows the same sequence. That suggests something systematic rather than intermittent sensor failures." Reynolds turned toward the young staff sergeant with an expression that suggested his observations were interesting but ultimately irrelevant to her professional assessment. "Staff Sergeant," she said, with the patience typically reserved for children asking technical questions, "consistent failure patterns can often result from systematic sensor calibration errors that create reproducible false readings. The sophistication of modern engine management systems means that multiple sensors can fail in coordinated ways that appear systematic but are actually the result of cascading electronic failures." As Reynolds began setting up her sophisticated diagnostic equipment with theatrical precision, Tank found himself increasingly frustrated by the gap between what he was observing and what the expensive consultant was proposing to investigate. The convergence of expensive expertise, institutional pressure, and practical knowledge was creating exactly the kind of situation that Tank had encountered repeatedly during his military career. Moments when political considerations overwhelmed. Technical competence and problems remained unsolved because the people with real understanding were dismissed in favor of those with better credentials and higher fees. What none of the Marines realized was that their solution stood less than 100 yards away, hidden behind the social invisibility that society imposed on veterans who had fallen through the cracks of institutional support. The morning's events were building toward a confrontation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about expertise, competence, and the true cost of ignoring those who had served their country with distinction. 2 hours into Dr. Reynolds' expensive diagnostic procedures, the sophisticated equipment that had arrived with such fanfare was producing results that contradicted her confident initial assessment. The specialized sensors and computer analysis systems were generating data that looked impressive on digital displays, but failed to identify any of the sensor integration failures she had predicted with such authority. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster watched the consultant's growing frustration with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from seeing expensive expertise prove inadequate to solve real-world problems. Melissa's years of hands-on experience had taught her to recognize when theoretical knowledge collided with mechanical reality, and Reynolds's increasingly defensive explanations suggested they were witnessing exactly that kind of collision. "The preliminary sensor sweeps aren't showing the integration failures I expected," Reynolds announced to the assembled group, her voice carrying less confidence than it had 2 hours earlier. "We may be dealing with intermittent failures that require extended monitoring to identify the specific failure patterns." Master Sergeant Robert Hill exchanged glances with Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans, both men recognizing the diplomatic language that consultants used when their initial diagnosis proved incorrect. Extended monitoring was consultant speak. "For I don't know what's wrong, but I need more time to figure it out without admitting my expertise was inadequate." "Dr. Reynolds," Hill said carefully, "extended monitoring could take us past our demonstration deadline. Is there any way to accelerate the diagnostic process?" Reynolds' expression tightened as she processed the implications of admitting that her sophisticated equipment and expensive expertise might not be sufficient to solve the Apache's problems within the required time frame. Her consulting reputation depended on being able to provide solutions that justified her fees, and failure at Camp Pendleton could affect her future contracts across the military establishment. Complex engine management failures require thorough analysis, Reynolds replied, falling back on technical authority to mask her growing uncertainty. Rushing the diagnostic process could result in misidentifying the problem and implementing solutions that don't address the root cause. General Taylor had been observing Reynolds' work with increasing impatience. Her Iron Lady reputation was built on an intolerance for excuses that didn't produce results. "Dr. Reynolds," Taylor interrupted, her voice carrying the edge that made subordinates extremely uncomfortable. "I didn't authorize expensive consulting fees to hear about the complexity of diagnostic procedures. I authorized them to get results that keep this aircraft operational. How long do you actually need to solve this problem?" The direct challenge forced Reynolds into the uncomfortable position of providing specific commitments rather than hiding behind technical qualifications. "General, based on the diagnostic complexity we're encountering, I would estimate another 8 to 12 hours for comprehensive analysis," Reynolds said, her confident demeanor wavering under Taylor's intense scrutiny. "The engine management system appears to have multiple overlapping failure modes that require systematic isolation and testing. 12 hours would push them beyond the demonstration deadline, a reality that everyone present understood immediately. The Pentagon officials and international allies expecting to witness Apache capabilities wouldn't be interested in explanations about diagnostic complexity. They would see a military that couldn't maintain its primary attack helicopter in operational condition. Captain Matthew Lewis approached the group with flight logs and technical documentation that detailed every aspect of the Apache's recent operational history. His pilot's perspective provided insights that complemented the maintenance crew's mechanical understanding, and his frustration with the consultant's ineffective approach was becoming increasingly apparent. "Dr. Reynolds," Matthew said, consulting his flight records with professional precision, "the failure pattern we've documented doesn't match intermittent sensor problems. The shutdown sequence is identical every time specific systems fail in exactly the same order at precisely the same power settings. That suggests a systematic problem rather than random electronic failures." Reynolds studied Matthew's documentation with the expression of someone whose theoretical expertise was being challenged by practical operational experience. The pilot's observations were technically sophisticated and based on extensive flight time, making them difficult to dismiss with consultant authority. "Captain Lewis," Reynolds replied carefully, "modern engine management systems can create reproducible failure patterns even when the underlying problems are electronic rather than mechanical. The computer systems are designed to follow specific shutdown protocols when they detect anomalous conditions." The explanation was technically plausible but failed to address why sophisticated diagnostic equipment couldn't identify the specific anomalous conditions that were triggering the shutdown protocols. Matthew's pilot training had taught him to recognize when technical explanations didn't match observed behavior, and Reynolds' assessment increasingly felt like expensive guesswork. From his position at the perimeter fence, Tank had been watching the consultant's failed diagnostic attempts with growing frustration. His weathered hands gripped the chain-link fence as he observed expensive equipment failing to identify problems that his trained eye could see from 100 yards away. The Apache's problem was becoming clear to Tank in ways that had nothing to do with sophisticated diagnostic equipment. The helicopter's posture, the specific configuration of access panels, and the maintenance crew's focus on certain systems told a story that could be read by someone who understood how these aircraft behaved under stress. But Tank's social invisibility meant his insights remained as worthless as his appearance suggested to people who measured expertise by credentials rather than competence. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis, had been operating one of Reynolds's diagnostic computers when he noticed readings that contradicted the consultant's theoretical framework. The young Marine's limited experience was nevertheless sufficient to recognize when equipment was producing data that didn't support the explanations being offered by expensive expertise. "Dr. Reynolds," Ethan said hesitantly, "I'm getting power. The distribution readings that don't match sensor integration failures. The electrical systems are drawing power normally until we reach specific load conditions, and everything drops simultaneously. That looks more like a mechanical governor problem than electronic sensor issues." Reynolds turned toward Ethan with the kind of professional irritation that consultants typically reserved for enlisted personnel who questioned their assessment methods. Her consulting reputation depended on maintaining authority over technical discussions, and challenges from junior Marines threatened the credibility that justified her fees. "Staff Sergeant," Reynolds said with barely concealed condescension, "power distribution anomalies can result from multiple causes, including sensor failures that create false load readings. The sophisticated analysis required to distinguish between mechanical and electronic causes exceeds the capabilities of standard military diagnostic equipment." The dismissal was delivered with sufficient authority to discourage further questions, but it failed to address why Reynolds's sophisticated equipment hadn't identified the specific sensor failures she claimed were causing the power distribution anomalies. Ethan's observation was based on direct measurement rather than theoretical assessment, making it difficult to dismiss with consultant expertise. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, adding physical discomfort to the mounting institutional pressure surrounding the maintenance crisis, Tank's frustration had reached the point where his professional integrity was warring with his social invisibility. From his position at the fence, he could see that the maintenance crew had covered most of the diagnostic areas that actually mattered, while the expensive consultant was focusing on systems that were functioning normally. The Apache's problem was hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone who understood how these aircraft actually behaved under operational stress rather than laboratory conditions. The convergence of expensive failure, institutional pressure, and genuine expertise was creating exactly the kind of crisis that Tank had learned to recognize during his military career moments when political considerations prevented practical solutions and problems remained unsolved because the people with real understanding were dismissed in favor of those with better credentials and higher fees. As Dr. Reynolds prepared for another round of sophisticated diagnostic procedures that had already proven inadequate, the sound of rattling chain-link fence was about to cut through the heated discussions like a knife through silk, transforming the day's events from expensive consulting failure into something approaching institutional reckoning. The sound of rattling chain-link fence cut through the heated discussions around Dr. Reynolds's failing diagnostic equipment like a knife through silk. Every head in the maintenance area turned toward the perimeter where a figure in torn clothing was climbing over the 8-foot security barrier with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate obstacles that society placed in his path. Tank dropped to the ground on the base side of the fence with surprising agility for someone whose weathered appearance suggested years of hard living. His movements carried the muscle memory of military training that hadn't been erased by homelessness or abandonment, and his direct approach toward the Apache helicopter was guided by purpose rather than desperation. Lieutenant Angela Stone was the first to react to the security breach, her military police training triggering automatic responses to unauthorized personnel entering restricted areas. At 27, Angela had earned her reputation through careful attention to regulations and procedures, and the appearance of a homeless civilian in a sensitive maintenance area represented exactly the kind of situation that required immediate intervention. "Sir, you need to stop right there," Angela called out, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio to to summon additional security support. This is a restricted military installation. You're not authorized to be in this area. Tank paused. In his approach toward the Apache, his weathered features showing no surprise at the military police response, but also no indication that he intended to comply with orders to leave. His keen eyes remained focused on the helicopter with an intensity that suggested professional interest rather than casual curiosity. "Ma'am, I know this is restricted," Tank replied, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who had spent too many nights sleeping rough, but also the measured cadence of someone accustomed to military protocol. "But that Apache's got a mechanical governor problem that's got nothing to do with sensor integration failures. Your consultant's been looking in all the wrong places." The casual technical assessment delivered by a homeless vagrant sent ripples of astonishment through the assembled military personnel. General Taylor stepped forward with an expression that shifted rapidly from irritation at the security breach to something approaching outrage at the presumption of someone whose appearance suggested he couldn't possibly possess relevant technical knowledge. "Security," Taylor barked, her voice cutting across the maintenance area with command authority. "Remove this individual immediately. We don't have time for vagrant interruptions while we're dealing with critical maintenance issues." Frank Bulldog Montgomery emerged from the base security office with the purposeful stride of someone whose job involved dealing with exactly these kinds of situations. At 58, Bulldog had transitioned from active Marine duty to base security, with the understanding that military installations attracted various types of people who didn't belong in restricted areas. "Come on, buddy," Bulldog said as he approached Tank, his tone mixing professional authority with the kind of weary patience that came from dealing with frequent fence jumpers. "You know you can't be here. Let's make this easy and head back toward the gate." Tank turned toward Bulldog with an expression that showed recognition rather than resistance. The two veterans sized each other up with the quick assessment that military personnel learn to make when encountering others who might share similar experiences and challenges. "Bulldog Montgomery," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying something that might have been relief at encountering someone whose background could bridge the gap between his current appearance and his forgotten expertise. "You probably don't remember me, but we served together in Fallujah back in 04. I'm Alexander. Woods used to go by Tank because I could fix anything with rotors." Bulldog's expression shifted from professional security response to something approaching shock as he processed the name and tried to reconcile his memories of a decorated Apache maintenance specialist with the homeless veteran standing before him. The transformation was visible as recognition battled with disbelief and professional obligation. "Tank Woods?" Bulldog said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that connected past excellence with present tragedy. "Jesus Christ. Tank, what the hell happened to you? Last I heard, you were the best Apache mechanic in the course, had some kind of special assignment with classified modifications." The conversation between the two veterans was being observed with growing interest by the maintenance crew and mounting irritation by General Taylor, whose schedule didn't allow for reminiscences between security personnel and unauthorized civilians. The demonstration deadline was approaching rapidly, and expensive consulting had failed to provide solutions that justified the fees and political capital invested in civilian expertise. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward with an expression that mixed professional condescension with institutional authority, clearly viewing the homeless veteran's technical claims as exactly the kind of amateur interference that complicated serious consulting work. A reputation depended on maintaining control over technical discussions, and Tank's intervention threatened the credibility that justified her fees. "General Taylor," Reynolds said with smooth authority, "I recommend we clear the maintenance area of unauthorized personnel so we can continue our diagnostic work without further interruptions." Complex technical problems require focused analysis without amateur interference. Tank turned toward Reynolds with eyes that reflected years of practical experience confronting theoretical expertise that failed to match operational reality. His appearance might mark him as society's discarded casualty, but his understanding of Apache helicopter maintenance had been forged through combat conditions that civilian consultants couldn't simulate in laboratory settings. "Ma'am, with respect," Tank said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who understood military hierarchy, but also recognized when institutional authority was preventing practical solutions. "I've been watching your diagnostic approach for the past 3 hours. You're testing sensor integration pathways that are functioning normally while ignoring the mechanical governor system that's actually causing the power distribution failures." The specific technical assessment delivered with quiet confidence sent another wave of surprise through the assembled personnel. Tank's observation was sophisticated enough to demonstrate genuine understanding, while directly challenging the consultant's methodology in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed with credential authority. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster stepped forward with an expression that reflected professional curiosity about Tank's assessment combined with skepticism about accepting technical advice from someone whose appearance suggested he lived on society's margins rather than in military maintenance facilities. "Sir," Melissa said carefully, "the mechanical governor system was one of the first components we tested. All readings showed normal operation across standard parameters. What makes you think we're dealing with a governor problem rather than the electronic issues Dr. Reynolds identified?" Tank's weathered features showed the first hint of something that might have been satisfaction as he recognized that at least one member of the maintenance crew was willing to engage with his technical assessment rather than dismissing him based on his appearance. His response would either validate his claims or expose them as the desperate theories of someone whose understanding was outdated or inadequate. "Sergeant, the governor's not failing under standard test parameters," Tank explained, his voice gaining confidence as he moved into technical territory where his expertise remained sharp despite years of institutional abandonment. "It's failing under dynamic load conditions that only occur when the engine reaches specific power settings under actual flight stress. Your diagnostic equipment is testing static conditions that don't replicate the harmonic resonances that trigger the governor malfunction." The explanation was technically sophisticated and addressed specific symptoms that the maintenance crew had documented, but hadn't been able to explain through conventional diagnostic approaches. Master Sergeant Robert Hill exchanged glances with Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans, both men recognizing technical competence when they heard it, regardless of its source. General Taylor's patience had reached its absolute limit as she processed the reality that a homeless vagrant was providing technical assessments that sounded more credible than the expensive consultant's theoretical explanations. Her Iron Lady reputation had been built on cutting through inefficiency and focusing on results. But the current situation challenged her fundamental assumptions about expertise and institutional competence. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Taylor announced, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made subordinates extremely nervous. "I refuse to waste more time listening to technical theories from someone who obviously lacks the credentials and clearance necessary to understand complex military aircraft systems." Tank looked directly at General Taylor with an expression that showed no intimidation despite the vast difference in their current positions and social status. His years of homelessness had taught him that dignity was something that couldn't be taken away by institutional authority, only surrendered by those who chose to abandon their own sense of worth. "General," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying the respect due to rank, combined with the confidence of someone who knew his technical assessment was correct. "I don't have credentials anymore, but I have 15 years of Apache maintenance experience, including combat modifications that saved lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. Your Apache's got a governor resonance problem that won't show up on static testing, and I can prove it. The challenge was delivered with such quiet confidence that it cut through the morning heat and institutional noise like a blade through bureaucratic confusion. Tank was offering to demonstrate expertise that could solve the crisis threatening to embarrass the Marine Corps. But accepting his help would require admitting that a homeless veteran possessed capabilities that expensive consultants lacked. Major David Crawford stepped forward with the political instincts that had guided his career, recognizing that his superior's reputation depended on finding solutions rather than maintaining institutional pride about the sources of those solutions. His intervention would either diffuse the confrontation or escalate it beyond any possibility of face-saving compromise. "General Taylor," Crawford said carefully, "perhaps we should allow Mr. Woods to demonstrate his assessment. If he's incorrect, we've lost nothing more than a few minutes. If he's correct, we could solve our maintenance crisis before the demonstration deadline." The suggestion hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, offering both solution and humiliation, depending on whether Tank's assessment proved accurate or delusional. General Taylor was being asked to bet her reputation on the technical competence of a homeless veteran whose appearance suggested he couldn't be trusted with basic personal care, much less multi-million-dollar military equipment. The morning sun reached its zenith over Camp Pendleton as the most important decision of the day balanced on the edge of institutional pride versus practical necessity. Tank's quiet confidence suggested he understood exactly what he was proposing to prove, while the expensive consultant's theoretical expertise had already proven inadequate to solve the Apache's stubborn problems. General Taylor's jaw worked silently as she processed the impossible choice before her: trust the technical assessment of a homeless veteran whose appearance suggested complete professional failure, or continue relying on expensive consultants whose sophisticated equipment had produced nothing but theoretical excuses for 3 days of mounting crisis. The demonstration deadline loomed less than 36 hours away, with Pentagon officials and international allies expecting to witness the Marine Corps' premier attack helicopter performing at peak capability. Failure would mean more than professional embarrassment. It would affect defense contracts worth hundreds of millions and potentially compromise America's military reputation on the global stage. "Mr. Woods," Taylor said finally, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone whose career hung in the balance, "you're claiming that you can diagnose and repair a problem that has stumped our entire maintenance crew and a Pentagon consultant with sophisticated diagnostic equipment. That's either remarkable competence or dangerous delusion." Tank met the general's intense gaze with steady confidence that reflected years of technical experience tested under combat conditions where failure meant death rather than professional embarrassment. His weathered features showed no doubt about his ability to deliver on promises that sounded impossible to people who measured expertise by credentials rather than practical competence. "General, I'm not claiming anything I can't prove," Tank replied quietly. "Give me 30 minutes with that Apache, and I'll show you exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. If I'm wrong, you can have base security escort me off the installation permanently." The stakes of Tank's offer were clear to everyone present. He was betting his credibility and his freedom against the Marine Corps' most pressing maintenance crisis, offering to solve a problem that had defeated expensive expertise or accept permanent banishment from the base where he had once served. With distinction, Dr. Reynolds stepped forward with barely concealed irritation, recognizing that accepting Tank's challenge would represent institutional acknowledgement that her expensive consulting had failed where vagrant intuition might succeed. Her professional reputation depended on maintaining authority over technical discussions, and Tank's intervention threatened the foundation of her consulting empire. "General Taylor," Reynolds said with smooth professional authority, "I must advise against allowing unauthorized personnel access to sensitive military equipment. The Apache represents a $40 million investment, and improper diagnostic procedures could cause additional damage. That would extend our maintenance timeline even further." The warning was technically reasonable, but politically motivated. Designed to protect Reynolds' consulting contract rather than solve the Apache's problems. Her objection emphasized institutional risk, while ignoring the reality that conventional approaches had already proven inadequate to meet critical deadlines. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster had been observing Tank's confident demeanor and specific technical language with growing professional interest. Her years of hands-on maintenance experience had taught her to recognize genuine expertise regardless of its packaging, and Tank's assessment of governor resonance problems addressed symptoms that sophisticated diagnostic equipment had failed to explain. "General," Melissa interjected carefully, "Mr. Woods' assessment of dynamic load conditions matches observations we've made but haven't been able to explain through conventional testing. If he understands something we've missed, 30 minutes could save us days of continued diagnostic work." The support from experienced maintenance personnel carried weight that consulting authority couldn't match. Melissa's endorsement was based on practical recognition rather than theoretical credentials, and her willingness to vouch for Tank's technical assessment provided General Taylor with professional cover for an unprecedented decision. Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans approached the group with maintenance logs and technical documentation that detailed every diagnostic procedure attempted over the past 3 days. His 20 years of aircraft maintenance had taught him to recognize when conventional approaches were failing and unconventional solutions deserved consideration. "General Taylor," Evans said, with the measured authority of senior enlisted experience, "we've exhausted standard diagnostic protocols without identifying the failure mode that's causing consistent shutdowns. If Mr. Woods has insights that our equipment missed, we're running out of alternatives to explore." The accumulating support from maintenance professionals was creating momentum that made Tank's proposal increasingly difficult to dismiss. General Taylor found herself facing the reality that institutional pride might be preventing practical solutions, and her Iron Lady reputation depended on results rather than protecting consulting contracts. Captain Matthew Lewis had been reviewing his flight logs during the discussion, cross-referencing Tank's assessment of dynamic load conditions with the specific power settings that triggered Apache shutdowns. His pilot's understanding of aircraft behavior provided insights that complemented maintenance expertise, and Tank's explanation addressed operational symptoms that electronic diagnostics couldn't capture. "General," Matthew said, consulting his documentation with professional precision. "The shutdown pattern Mr. Woods described matches exactly what I've experienced during flight testing. The failures occur at specific power settings under load conditions that wouldn't be replicated during static diagnostic procedures." The pilot's confirmation provided additional validation for Tank's technical assessment while highlighting the limitations of consultant approaches that focused on laboratory conditions rather than operational reality. Matthew's flight experience bridged the gap between theoretical diagnostics and practical aircraft behavior, supporting Tank's claims about governor resonance problems. Tank had been listening to the discussion with the patient confidence of someone who understood that his technical assessment would ultimately be validated by mechanical reality rather than institutional politics. His years of combat maintenance had taught him that aircraft problems couldn't be solved through authority or credentials, only through genuine understanding of how complex systems behaved under stress. "General," Tank said quietly, "I can show Use the specific access panel that needs to be opened to reach the mechanical governor assembly. The resonance problem affects a secondary dampening system that's not covered in standard diagnostic protocols because most mechanics don't know it exists. The claim about secondary systems unknown to standard protocols sent ripples of interest through the maintenance crew while triggering skepticism from Dr. Reynolds, whose consulting expertise was being challenged by suggestions that official technical manuals were incomplete or inadequate. Frank Bulldog Montgomery had been observing the entire confrontation with growing recognition that his old comrade's technical assessment was being validated by current maintenance personnel despite his homeless appearance. Bulldog's memory of Tank's legendary competence during their shared service provided historical context that supported present claims about Apache expertise. General Taylor, Bulldog said, with the authority of someone whose service record commanded respect. I worked with Tank in Fallujah when he developed modifications that kept Apache helicopters operational under conditions that should have grounded the entire fleet. If he says he can fix this bird, I'd bet my pension on his assessment. The endorsement from base security carried institutional weight while providing General Taylor with additional cover for an unprecedented decision. Bulldog's willingness to stake his reputation on Tank's technical competence created momentum that made continued resistance increasingly difficult to justify. Major David Crawford recognized that his superior was approaching a decision point that would define her command legacy. His political instincts suggested that betting on Tank's expertise offered better odds than continuing with consulting approaches that had already proven inadequate to meet critical deadlines. General, Crawford said carefully, Mr. Woods is offering to solve our maintenance crisis with minimal risk and maximum potential benefit. If he fails, we've lost 30 minutes. If he succeeds, we meet our demonstration deadline with time to spare. The political calculation was simple enough to understand even under pressure. Tank's proposal offered low-risk, high-reward possibilities that expensive consulting couldn't match, and his confident demeanor suggested he understood exactly what he was promising to deliver. Dr. Reynolds made one final attempt to maintain control over the technical discussion, recognizing that Tank's success would represent complete invalidation of her consulting approach and potential damage to her professional reputation across the military establishment. General Taylor, Reynolds said with smooth authority, I must emphasize that unauthorized diagnostic procedures could void warranty protections and create liability issues that extend far beyond immediate maintenance concerns. The responsible approach requires continued systematic analysis using approved methodologies. The warning was designed to emphasize institutional risk while protecting consulting interests, but it failed to address the reality that approved methodologies had already proven inadequate to solve the Apache's problems within required timelines. General Taylor looked around at the assembled personnel, expensive consultants defending failed approaches, experienced maintenance crew supporting unconventional solutions, and a homeless veteran offering to prove capabilities that sounded impossible but addressed symptoms that sophisticated equipment couldn't explain. Mr. Woods, Taylor said finally, a voice carrying the authority of someone whose decision would be remembered long after the day's events concluded. You have 30 minutes to demonstrate that your assessment is correct. If you damage that Apache or fail to identify the actual problem, you'll be banned from this installation permanently. The decision sent shock waves through the assembled group as everyone present recognized they were about to witness either remarkable vindication or spectacular failure. Tank's confident nod suggested he understood exactly what he had committed to prove, while the maintenance crew prepared to observe techniques that would either validate or destroy unconventional approaches to military aircraft diagnosis. The morning sun blazed down on Camp Pendleton as one of the military's most important diagnostic challenges, balanced on the technical competence of a man society had discarded, but whose expertise remained as sharp as the day. He had earned his legendary reputation in the desert battlefields of Iraq. Tank approached the Apache helicopter with movements that transformed him from homeless vagrant to master technician in the span of a few steps. His weathered hands moved across the aircraft's external panels with the confident precision of someone who understood every component, every access point, and every system interaction that made these complex machines function under impossible conditions. The change in Tank's demeanor was immediately apparent to everyone watching. Gone was the defensive posture of someone accustomed to dismissal and rejection, replaced by the focused competence of a professional who had found himself back in his element. His torn clothing and weathered appearance couldn't disguise the technical expertise that guided his systematic approach to the Apache's problems. "Sergeant Foster," Tank called out without looking away from the helicopter, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "I need a 7/16 socket wrench, a digital multimeter, and access to your oscilloscope equipment. We're going to check the mechanical governor's harmonic response under simulated load conditions." Melissa moved quickly to gather the requested tools, her professional instincts responding to Tank's confident technical language despite his unconventional appearance. The specific equipment request demonstrated knowledge that went beyond general maintenance understanding to include sophisticated diagnostic procedures that weren't covered in standard training programs. Tank knelt beside a maintenance panel that none of the other technicians had opened during 3 days of intensive diagnostic work. His fingers moved across concealed latches with muscle memory that hadn't been diminished by years of homelessness, revealing access to systems that most mechanics never encountered during routine maintenance procedures. "This panel leads to the secondary mechanical governor assembly," Tank explained as he worked, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had taught these procedures to countless other Marines. "It's not in the standard technical manuals because it was added as a combat modification after the original Apache design. Most maintenance crews don't know it exists." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward with barely concealed skepticism, her professional reputation depending on challenging Tank's claims before they could undermine her consulting authority. The suggestion that critical systems existed outside official documentation threatened the foundation of her expertise, which was built on mastery of published technical specifications. "Mr. Woods," Reynolds said with controlled professional doubt, "I've reviewed the complete Apache technical documentation, including classified modification supplements. There are no secondary governor assemblies that aren't covered in official maintenance protocols." Tank paused in his work to look directly at Reynolds, his expression showing the patient tolerance of someone who had encountered theoretical expertise that failed to match operational reality countless times during his military career. His weathered features reflected years of practical experience that couldn't be captured in consultant documentation. "Ma'am, the secondary governor was implemented through a classified field modification program in 2003. Tank replied quietly, returning his attention to the access panel. It was designed to prevent power distribution failures under combat stress loads that weren't anticipated in the original design specifications. The modification was never incorporated into standard technical manuals because it was developed in theater under operational security restrictions." The claim about classified modifications sent ripples of interest through the maintenance crew while creating professional anxiety for Dr. Reynolds, whose consulting expertise was being challenged by suggestions that her documentation was incomplete. Tank's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he exposed mechanical components that looked nothing like the systems shown in standard Apache maintenance manuals. The secondary governor assembly was compact and elegantly integrated with primary systems, but its existence outside official documentation explained why conventional diagnostic procedures had failed to identify its malfunction. Tank's weathered hands moved across the exposed components with the certainty of someone who had designed the very systems he was now diagnosing. Jesus, Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster breathed as she observed Tank's work. I've been maintaining Apaches for 8 years, and I've never seen that assembly. How is it possible that critical components aren't documented in our technical orders? Tank glanced up from his diagnostic work with an expression that reflected both professional satisfaction and something that might have been sadness about institutional failures that extended far beyond mechanical problems. His years of homelessness had taught him that important things were often overlooked or forgotten by systems that prioritize convenience over completeness. Sergeant, combat modifications happen fast when lives are at stake, Tank explained, connecting his multimeter to contact points that weren't marked in any maintenance manual. The secondary governor prevented Apache losses in Iraq when enemy fire damaged primary systems, but field modifications don't always make it back to peacetime documentation, especially when the people who developed them aren't around to explain how they work. The implicit reference to his own role in developing the modifications carried a weight that couldn't be dismissed as vagrant delusion. Tank's specific knowledge of system integration and combat applications demonstrated expertise that went beyond maintenance competence to include engineering innovation under battlefield conditions. Captain Matthew Lewis moved closer to observe Tank's diagnostic procedures, his pilot's understanding of Apache behavior providing context for the mechanical work being performed. Matthew's flight experience had taught him to recognize when technical explanations matched observed symptoms, and Tank's assessment was addressing operational problems that electronic diagnostics had failed to identify. Mr. Woods, Matthew said with professional interest, if the secondary governor is failing under dynamic loads, would that explain why the shutdowns always occur at the same power settings? The mechanical failure would trigger safety protocols that protect the primary systems from damage. Tank nodded approvingly while adjusting his oscilloscope settings to capture harmonic patterns that wouldn't be visible during static testing procedures. His diagnostic approach was revealing system interactions that sophisticated consulting equipment had missed because it wasn't designed to test for modifications that existed outside official documentation. Exactly right, Captain, Tank replied, his voice carrying genuine respect for Matthew's technical understanding. The secondary governor uses harmonic dampening to control power distribution under stress loads. When it fails, the safety protocols shut down everything to prevent cascade failures that could destroy the primary engine systems. The technical explanation was sophisticated enough to impress experienced maintenance personnel while addressing specific symptoms that had puzzled the entire crew for 3 days. Tank's diagnostic work was revealing mechanical interactions that connected all the observed problems into a coherent pattern that made perfect sense once the hidden system was understood. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis had been monitoring Tank's oscilloscope readings with growing excitement as the equipment displayed harmonic patterns that matched theoretical predictions for mechanical governor failures. The young Marine's enthusiasm was evident as he recognized that unconventional diagnostic procedures were producing results that expensive consulting had failed to achieve. Sir, Ethan called out, I'm seeing resonance spikes at exactly the frequencies you predicted. The harmonic distortion patterns match mechanical failure modes rather than the electronic sensor problems. Dr. Reynolds was investigating. The confirmation from sophisticated equipment provided objective validation for Tank's assessment while demonstrating that his diagnostic approach was based on genuine technical understanding rather than lucky guesswork. The oscilloscope readings offered scientific proof that couldn't be dismissed through consultant authority or institutional skepticism. Dr. Reynolds approached Tank's diagnostic station with professional concern that barely concealed growing alarm about the implications of his successful assessment. Her consulting reputation depended on being the expert who solved problems that stumped military personnel, and Tank's competence threatened the foundation of her professional identity. "Mr. Woods," Reynolds said carefully, "even if your assessment of the secondary governor is correct, repair procedures for undocumented modifications would require engineering specifications that aren't available through standard supply channels. How do you propose to implement solutions for systems that don't officially exist?" The challenge was technically reasonable, but failed to account for Tank's complete understanding of the modifications he had helped develop during combat deployment. His weathered features showed confidence that suggested he possessed not just diagnostic capabilities, but comprehensive knowledge of repair procedures that civilian consultants couldn't access through official channels. "Ma'am, the secondary governor can be repaired using standard components and basic machine shop modifications," Tank replied without pausing in his diagnostic work. The combat design was intentionally simple to allow field repairs under battlefield conditions. "I can have this system operational in less than 2 hours using parts already available in your supply inventory." The claim about rapid repair using standard components sent another wave of surprise through the maintenance crew while highlighting the practical advantages of combat-tested modifications over complex civilian engineering solutions. Tank's approach emphasized functionality over sophistication, battlefield reliability over laboratory perfection. Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans stepped forward with supply catalogs and inventory lists that documented every component available in Camp Pendleton's maintenance facilities. His 20 years of experience had taught him to recognize when repair procedures matched available resources, and Tank's confidence suggested genuine understanding of practical implementation requirements. "Mr. Woods," Evans said with growing professional respect, "if you can specify the components you need, I can have them gathered while you complete your diagnostic work. What exactly do we need to implement your repair procedures?" Tank looked up from his oscilloscope with an expression that showed satisfaction at encountering military professionalism that focused on solutions rather than obstacles. His years of homelessness had made him appreciate competence and efficiency when he encountered them, especially from people who treated him with respect despite his appearance. "Chief, I need 2 standard bearing assemblies, part number Apache 779 Delta, a basic harmonic dampener from any helicopter supply stock, and about 40 minutes with a standard machine shop to modify the mounting interface," Tank replied with precise technical specificity. "The repair is permanent and will actually improve system reliability beyond original specifications." The specific part numbers and modification procedures demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond general maintenance. Competence to include engineering expertise that can improve upon original Apache design specifications. Tank's assessment suggested that combat modifications represented advances rather than compromises in helicopter technology. General Taylor had been observing Tank's diagnostic work with growing recognition that her decision to trust Vagrant expertise over consultant authority was being validated by every measurement and technical assessment. Her Iron Lady reputation had been built on recognizing competence regardless of its packaging, and Tank's performance was demonstrating exactly the kind of practical expertise that military leadership needed to value and protect. "Mr. Woods," Taylor said with authority that carried undertones of growing respect, "your diagnostic work has identified problems that our best technical resources missed completely. If you can implement the repairs you've described within your timeline, you'll have proven capabilities that extend far beyond this single maintenance crisis." The recognition from senior leadership represented institutional acknowledgement that Tank's expertise was valuable despite his homeless status and unconventional appearance. His confident nod suggested he understood that successful repair would transform him from discarded veteran to recognized asset, but also that failure would confirm society's assessment of his worthlessness. As Tank prepared to begin repair procedures, that would either vindicate his claims or expose them as elaborate delusion. None of the assembled personnel realized they were witnessing more than aircraft maintenance. They were observing the intersection of institutional competence and individual dignity, where technical expertise could restore not just mechanical function, but human worth that had been forgotten by the systems designed to support those who served their country with distinction. Tank's hands moved with surgical precision as he began implementing repair procedures that would determine whether forgotten expertise could triumph over expensive consulting failure. Each movement was guided by muscle memory that had been forged in the heat of combat zones, where mechanical failure meant death for the pilots who depended on his expertise. The worn components told the story of stress and wear that matched his predictions about harmonic resonance failures under dynamic load conditions. This bearing assembly has been running outside specifications for months, Tank muttered as he examined the damaged components, his weathered features reflecting professional concern that transcended personal vindication. The harmonic dampeners, completely shot, which explains why the safety protocols have been triggering shutdowns to prevent catastrophic engine failure. Technical Sergeant Melissa Foster watched Tank's disassembly procedures with growing amazement at the systematic approach he brought to mechanical problems that had defeated sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Her 8 years of Apache maintenance had never exposed her to the level of detailed system knowledge that Tank demonstrated with casual competence. "Sir," Melissa said with genuine professional curiosity, "how did you learn about these modification procedures? The technical specifications you're describing aren't covered in any training program I've attended." Tank paused in his work to look at Melissa with an expression that carried both pride in past accomplishments and something approaching sadness about the circumstances that had led to his current situation. His years of homelessness had taught him that explaining his background often led to disbelief or pity, but the technical validation he was receiving encouraged honesty about his forgotten expertise. "Sergeant, I developed these modifications in Fallujah when we were losing Apache helicopters to combat damage that the original design couldn't handle," Tank explained, returning his attention to the damaged components. "A secondary governor system was my engineering solution to prevent total power loss when primary systems took hits from enemy fire." The casual reference to engineering solutions developed under combat conditions sent ripples of recognition through the maintenance crew as they began to understand that Tank's expertise extended far beyond routine maintenance to include innovation under battlefield pressure that had saved countless lives. Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Evans approached with the replacement components Tank had specified, his 20 years of experience enabling him to recognize engineering quality when he encountered it. The parts Tank had requested were standard inventory items, but his approach to using them demonstrated knowledge that went beyond conventional applications. "Mr. Woods," Evans said, with growing professional respect, "I've gathered the components you specified. The bearing assemblies are new stock, and the harmonic dampener came from a Huey supply kit. Will standard parts actually integrate with your modification system?" Tank accepted the components with the confident assessment of someone who understood how to adapt available resources to solve complex problems under field conditions. His combat experience had taught him that perfect parts were luxury items in war zones, and effective repairs often required creative engineering using whatever materials were accessible. "Chief, the beauty of combat modifications is that they're designed to work with whatever's available," Tank replied, examining the replacement parts with professional satisfaction. These bearing assemblies will actually improve performance beyond original specifications, and the Huey dampener has better harmonic characteristics than the original Apache components. The explanation demonstrated engineering understanding that impressed experienced maintenance personnel, while highlighting the practical advantages of battlefield innovation over laboratory perfection. Tank's approach emphasized functionality and reliability rather than adhering to theoretical design specifications that might not match operational requirements. Major David Crawford had been observing Tank's repair procedures with the political instincts that had guided his career, recognizing that successful completion would create institutional obligations that extended far beyond solving immediate maintenance problems. His superior's decision to trust Tank's expertise was being validated in ways that would require explanations and policy adjustments. "General Taylor," Crawford said quietly, "Mr. Woods' diagnostic accuracy and repair capabilities suggest expertise that could be valuable across our entire Apache fleet. His knowledge of undocumented modifications represents institutional memory that we've apparently lost through normal personnel rotation." The observation carried implications that extended beyond individual competence to include systematic failures in knowledge preservation that could affect military readiness across multiple installations. Tank's forgotten expertise represented exactly the kind of practical understanding that military institutions needed to identify and protect rather than allow to disappear through administrative neglect. Dr. Reynolds had been watching Tank's successful repair procedures with mounting professional anxiety as her expensive consulting failure was being overshadowed by vagrant competence that she couldn't explain or challenge through credential authority. Her reputation depended on being the expert who solved problems that stumped military personnel, and Tank's success threatened the foundation of her consulting empire. "General Taylor," Reynolds said with controlled professional concern, "while Mr. Woods has demonstrated remarkable diagnostic capabilities, implementing undocumented modifications raises liability and warranty issues that could affect the entire Apache program. Standard protocols exist to ensure safety and accountability in military maintenance procedures." The warning was technically reasonable, but politically motivated, designed to protect consulting interests rather than address the reality that standard protocols had failed to solve the Apache's problems, while Tank's unconventional approach was producing measurable results that could meet critical demonstration deadlines. Tank looked up from his repair work with an expression that showed patient tolerance for institutional obstacles that prioritized bureaucratic safety over practical solutions. His years of combat maintenance had taught him that real safety came from functional equipment rather than regulatory compliance, especially when lives depended on mechanical reliability. "Ma'am, with respect," Tank said calmly, "liability and warranty protection don't mean much to pilots when their aircraft fails during combat operations. The modifications I'm implementing have been combat tested under conditions that exceed any warranty specifications, and they've saved more lives than any documentation protocol." The quiet authority in Tank's response highlighted the difference between theoretical risk management and practical safety considerations that emerged from operational experience. His perspective emphasized results over procedures, battlefield reliability over administrative convenience. Captain Matthew Lewis stepped forward with flight test protocols that would validate Tank's repair work under the specific conditions that had triggered the original failures. His pilot's understanding of Apache performance characteristics provided operational context for the mechanical improvements Tank was implementing. "Mr. Woods," Matthew said with professional interest, "once you complete the governor repairs, what flight test procedures would you recommend to verify that the modifications address the power distribution failures we've been experiencing?" Tank nodded approvingly that Matthews focus on operational validation rather than theoretical compliance, recognizing pilot competence that matched his own mechanical expertise. His response would either demonstrate comprehensive understanding of flight test requirements or expose limitations in his technical knowledge. Captain, we'll need to run progressive power tests starting at 60% and building to full combat power in 10% increments. Tank replied without hesitation. The governor modifications will eliminate the harmonic resonance that was triggering safety shutdowns, but we should verify performance at each power level to ensure the dampening characteristics match flight requirements. The specific test protocol demonstrated understanding that went beyond repair procedures to include operational validation requirements that ensured modified systems would perform reliably under all flight conditions. Tank's comprehensive approach impressed both maintenance personnel and flight crew with its practical thoroughness. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis had been documenting Tank's repair procedures with digital photography and detailed notes that would preserve institutional knowledge for future maintenance requirements. His enthusiasm for learning from Tank's expertise was evident as he recognized the value of practical experience that couldn't be captured in standard technical manuals. "Sir," Ethan said with genuine excitement, "the modification techniques you're demonstrating could be applied to other aircraft systems that experience similar harmonic stress problems. Are there other Apache components that would benefit from your combat modification approaches?" Tank's weathered features showed satisfaction at encountering young Marines who were focused on learning rather than dismissing his expertise based on appearance or credentials. His years of homelessness had made him appreciate genuine curiosity and professional development when he encountered them from military personnel. Marine. The secondary governor is just one example of battlefield improvements that never made it into official documentation, Tank replied, installing the modified dampener assembly with practiced precision. There are hydraulic modifications, avionics improvements, and power distribution upgrades that could enhance performance and reliability across the entire fleet. The casual reference to multiple undocumented improvements sent another wave of recognition through the assembled personnel as they began to understand the scope of institutional knowledge that had been lost when Tank disappeared from official military service. His expertise represented systematic advances that could benefit Apache operations at installations throughout the military. As Tank began final assembly of the repaired governor system, his movements carried the confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was accomplishing. The modified components fit together with engineering precision that exceeded original specifications, creating mechanical harmony that would eliminate the stress patterns responsible for system failures. "Governor assembly is complete," Tank announced, his voice carrying professional satisfaction at work performed to his own exacting standards. The harmonic dampening characteristics are now optimized for combat load conditions, and the bearing assemblies will handle stress levels that exceed original design specifications by 30%. The technical assessment was delivered with quiet confidence that reflected genuine engineering expertise rather than hopeful estimation. Tank's repair work had transformed problematic components into improved systems that would perform better than original Apache specifications under all operational conditions. General Taylor approached Tank's work area with an expression that reflected both professional respect for demonstrated competence and growing recognition of institutional failures that had allowed valuable expertise to disappear into homelessness and neglect. Her Iron Lady reputation had been built on identifying and utilizing excellence, regardless of its packaging or social position. "Mr. Woods," Taylor said with authority that carried undertones of genuine respect, "your diagnostic accuracy and repair capabilities have exceeded anything we could have expected from civilian consulting or standard maintenance procedures. If Your modifications perform as predicted during flight testing. You've solved a crisis that threatened to embarrass the Marine Corps at the highest levels. The recognition from senior leadership represented institutional acknowledgement that Tank's expertise was valuable beyond immediate problem-solving to include systematic knowledge that could benefit military operations across multiple installations and platforms. His confident nod suggested he understood the broader implications while remaining focused on completing work that met his own professional standards. As Tank prepared for the critical flight test that would either validate his repair work or expose its limitations, none of the assembled personnel realized they were witnessing more than mechanical competence. They were observing the intersection of individual dignity and institutional responsibility, where forgotten expertise was reclaiming its rightful place in military operations despite years of bureaucratic neglect and social abandonment. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the California sky as Tank's weathered hands completed modifications that would determine whether discarded veterans still possessed capabilities that their country needed, but had chosen to ignore rather than nurture and preserve. The Apache helicopter sat on the flight line like a $40 million testament to Tank's forgotten expertise, its modified governor system waiting for the ultimate validation that only actual flight conditions could provide. Captain Matthew Lewis completed his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on mechanical reliability. His experienced hands-checking systems that had been the subject of 3 days of frustrated diagnostic work. All external systems show normal configuration, Matthew announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone preparing to test repairs that could either vindicate remarkable competence or expose dangerous amateur. Modification. Engine management displays are showing green across all monitored parameters. Tank stood beside the maintenance crew with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what his repair work had accomplished, but also recognized that mechanical theory meant nothing until tested under the dynamic load conditions that had caused the original failures. His weathered features reflected years of experience with combat situations where confidence had to be backed by performance under pressure. General Taylor positioned herself where she could observe both the flight test and Tank's reactions to the aircraft's performance. Her Iron Lady reputation was now directly tied to the success or failure of trusting vagrant expertise over expensive consulting authority. The demonstration deadline loomed less than 24 hours away, and her decision to bet on Tank's capabilities would either save the Marine Corps from embarrassment or compound it with spectacular failure. Dr. Reynolds watched the pre-flight procedures with barely concealed anxiety about the implications of Tank's successful repair work for her consulting reputation and future military contracts. Her sophisticated diagnostic equipment had failed where homeless intuition succeeded, creating professional humiliation that could affect her entire business model if word spread through Pentagon consulting networks. General Taylor Reynolds said with controlled professional concern, "I must emphasize that flight testing unverified modifications represents significant risk to both personnel and equipment. Standard protocols require extensive ground testing before implementing flight validation procedures." The warning was technically reasonable, but ignored the reality that 3 days of ground testing had failed to identify problems that Tank diagnosed and repaired in less than 4 hours. Reynolds' objection emphasized procedural safety over practical results, bureaucratic caution over demonstrated competence. Tank turned toward Reynolds with an expression that showed patient tolerance for institutional obstacles that prioritized regulatory compliance over operational effectiveness. His years of combat maintenance had taught him that real safety came from functional equipment rather than procedural compliance, especially when lives depended on mechanical reliability under stress conditions. "Ma'am," Tank replied quietly, The modifications I've implemented have been combat tested under conditions that exceed any ground simulation capabilities. Every component has been validated through operational use that included enemy fire, extreme weather, and mission profiles that civilian testing couldn't replicate. The reference to combat validation carried authority that Reynolds' laboratory expertise couldn't match, highlighting the difference between theoretical testing and practical reliability that emerged from battlefield experience. Tank's perspective emphasized proven performance over regulatory compliance. The helicopter's engine spooled up with the distinctive whine of turboshaft power plants, generating the tremendous energy required to lift and maneuver a heavily armed attack helicopter. Tank listened to the engine's signatures with the trained ear of someone who could diagnose mechanical problems through subtle changes in sound that most people would never notice. Engine parameters are normal across all systems, Matthew reported through his headset as the Apache lifted into hover configuration. Power management is responding smoothly without the hesitation patterns we experienced during previous test attempts. The initial success sent ripples of cautious optimism through the assembled maintenance crew, while providing Tank with validation that his diagnostic assessment had been accurate. The modified governor system was performing exactly as his engineering calculations had predicted, eliminating the harmonic interference that had triggered safety shutdowns. Staff Sergeant Ethan Davis monitored the real-time diagnostic data streaming from the aircraft systems, his enthusiasm evident as the equipment displayed performance patterns that exceeded expectations for standard Apache operations. The young Marine's excitement was infectious as he recognized that Tank's modifications were producing measurable improvements. "Sir," Ethan called out to Tank, "the harmonic patterns are incredibly smooth compared to our baseline readings. The governor modifications are actually improving power distribution efficiency beyond what we normally see in standard configurations." Tank's weathered features showed satisfaction at the confirmation that his combat modifications represented advances rather than compromises in helicopter technology. His engineering approach had always focused on improving performance rather than simply maintaining original specifications that might not match operational requirements. Captain Matthew Lewis pushed the Apache through increasingly demanding power settings, each test phase validating Tank's repair work while demonstrating capability improvements that exceeded original design specifications. The helicopter's response was crisp and immediate, without the hesitation and shutdown sequences that had plagued previous flight attempts. 60% power, all systems nominal, Matthew reported with growing confidence. 70% smooth power delivery without any resonance issues. 80% performance characteristics are actually better than baseline specifications. The progressive validation was being observed with mounting excitement by maintenance personnel, who were witnessing not just successful repair work, but systematic performance improvements that could benefit Apache operations across the entire fleet. Tank's modifications represented exactly the kind of battlefield innovation that military institutions needed to identify and preserve. General Taylor watched the flight test results with growing recognition that Tank's expertise extended far beyond solving immediate maintenance problems to include engineering capabilities that could enhance military effectiveness across multiple platforms and installations. Her decision to trust his assessment was being validated in ways that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. "Mr. Woods," Taylor said with authority that carried undertones of genuine respect, "your modifications are not only solving our immediate crisis, but improving Apache performance beyond standard specifications. That level of engineering competence represents institutional assets that the Marine Corps needs to recognize and utilize." The acknowledgement from senior leadership represented more than professional recognition. It suggested institutional commitment to preserving and developing Tank's expertise rather than allowing it to disappear back into homeless obscurity. Tank's confident nod indicated he understood the broader implications while remaining focused on completing the validation process. As Captain Matthew Lewis pushed the Apache toward full combat power settings, the critical moment approached when Tank's modifications would face the ultimate test under conditions that had consistently triggered system failures during previous attempts. The assembled personnel held their breath as the helicopter approached the power levels that had defeated sophisticated diagnostic equipment and expensive consulting expertise. 90% power, all systems responding normally, Matthew reported with barely contained excitement. Approaching full combat power, no hesitation, no anomalies, smooth power delivery across all parameters. The successful transition to full power represented complete validation of Tank's diagnostic accuracy and repair competence, while demonstrating that his engineering modifications could withstand the stress conditions that had caused original system failures. The Apache was performing better than it had since delivery from the manufacturer. Full combat power achieved, Matthew announced with triumph evident in his voice. All systems nominal, power distribution smooth across all flight configurations. The helicopter is performing flawlessly under conditions that previously caused immediate shutdowns. The successful completion of the flight test sent waves of excitement through the maintenance crew while providing Tank with vindication that went beyond professional competence to include personal dignity that had been eroded by years of institutional neglect and social abandonment. As the Apache landed with systems performing beyond original specifications, Tank stood quietly among the celebrating Marines with an expression that reflected both satisfaction at work completed to his own standards and something approaching peace about circumstances that had led to his current situation. His technical vindication was complete, but more importantly, his expertise would no longer be forgotten. Frank Bulldog Montgomery approached Tank with obvious pride in his old comrade's achievement, but also with growing determination about addressing the injustices that had led to such extraordinary expertise being abandoned by the military systems designed to nurture and preserve it. Tank, Bulldog said quietly, you've just proven what some of us never forgot, that you're one of the finest Apache specialists the Marine Corps ever produced. But that makes what happened to you even more inexcusable, and we're going to make sure it never happens to another veteran. The comment carried implications that extended beyond individual competence to include institutional changes that would honor the service of all veterans, rather than abandoning them to homelessness while their expertise was forgotten by the systems they had served with distinction. The celebration surrounding the Apache's successful flight test was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan, whose government plates and purposeful approach suggested that Tank's demonstration of extraordinary expertise had attracted attention from sources beyond Camp Pendleton's immediate command structure. Colonel Jeffrey Walsh approached General Taylor with a secure communication device and an expression that suggested the Apache maintenance crisis had escalated into something approaching institutional reckoning. General Taylor, Walsh said quietly, I have the Secretary of Defense on secure communication, requesting immediate briefing about the maintenance breakthrough and specifically wanting to discuss Mr. Woods' background and current status. It appears that Tank's name has triggered some very high-level interest in Washington. The mention of Secretary of Defense involvement sent ripples of recognition through the assembled personnel as they began to understand that Tank's technical competence had attracted attention from people whose decisions affected military policy at the national level. The homeless veteran's successful repair work was being viewed as more than individual achievement. It represented systematic issues that required cabinet-level attention. General Taylor accepted the secure communication device while recognizing that her conversation with defense leadership would determine not just Tank's future, but potentially her own career trajectory. The Iron Lady's decision to trust vagrant expertise over consultant authority was being scrutinized by people whose approval she needed for continued advancement. "Mr. Secretary," Taylor said into the encrypted device, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone whose decisions were being evaluated at the highest levels of government. "The maintenance crisis has been resolved through the intervention of Mr. Alexander Woods, a former Marine Apache specialist whose expertise exceeded our conventional diagnostic capabilities." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, painting the California sky in shades of orange and purple, Tank's extraordinary day was transforming from personal vindication into institutional reckoning that would force military and political leadership to confront systematic failures that had abandoned decorated veterans while rewarding civilian incompetence. The promise of institutional support was delivered with command authority that suggested genuine commitment. But Tank's response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that true success would be measured, not by personal vindication, but by institutional changes that prevented future veterans from experiencing the abandonment that had marked his own journey from decorated specialist to society's invisible casualty. "General," Tank replied quietly, "I appreciate the recognition, but what I care about most is that today's work helps other veterans avoid the abandonment I've experienced. The real victory won't be my own restoration. It'll be making sure the military never again loses the expertise of those who served with honor." As the sun set over Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the flight line where the Apache helicopter sat as testament to Tank's forgotten expertise, the homeless veteran who had solved the Marine Corps' most pressing maintenance crisis stood quietly among the Marines whose respect he had earned while recognizing that true success would be measured by institutional changes that honored all veterans rather than abandoning them to homelessness while their expertise was forgotten by the systems they had served with distinction and sacrifice. The extraordinary day was ending, but Tank's story was just beginning its transformation from individual achievement into catalyst for institutional accountability that would ensure no decorated veteran would ever again fall through the cracks of a system designed to support those who had given everything in service to their country. If you enjoyed this incredible story of Tank's triumph over adversity and institutional betrayal, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We bring you real-life tales of justice, revenge, and the human spirit that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Did Tank's story of redemption inspire you? Have you ever witnessed expertise being overlooked because of someone's appearance? Share your thoughts and experiences with our community. And if this story moved you, wait until you see what we have. Coming next. Tomorrow, we're sharing another jaw-dropping tale that will challenge everything you think you know about justice and second chances. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you never miss these incredible true stories.